I spent 30 years dissecting things the Department of Defense wanted forgotten. I've handled lungs turned to black glass by weaponized gas and tissue samples from Bikini Atoll that literally glowed in the dark room. You develop a certain emotional callosity in this line of work. You have to. If you let the horror of what you're looking at get past the scalpel, you don't last a month. But what they brought to the Okanogan Pass in December of 1983, that wasn't a pathogen, it was a primate, a bipedal, 900-pound primate. And the military made the mistake of thinking it was solitary. My name is Dr. Raymond Mercer. In December of 1983, I was 58 years old, working as a civilian contracted comparative pathologist under the DED's Division of Biological Security. My job was simple. When something died in a military testing zone or was recovered from a classified operation and it didn't match the known taxonomy of the natural world, it came to my table in Bethesda. But the knock on my door at 2 a.m. on December 14 wasn't standard. The rain in Maryland had turned to a freezing sleet that coated the drive in black ice. The two men standing on my porch wore heavy wool overcoats that didn't show badges, but their posture was unmistakable. They didn't have a warrant, and they didn't explain the mission. They simply told me that a transport was waiting at Andrews Air Force Base. "It's biological, Mercer," the taller one said as I pulled on my cold-weather gear. "And it's fresh. We have a 48-hour window before cellular degradation ruins the internal structures. Move." By 5 a.m., I was in the cargo bay of a Lockheed C-130 Hercules, listening to the 4 Allison turboprops scream as we headed northwest. The air in the bay was freezing, smelling of hydraulic fluid, canvas, and military-grade kerosene. By dawn, we had touched down at a military airfield in central Washington state. From there, they transferred me directly to a Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallion. The pilot flew low, navigating a blinding winter blizzard that had dropped over the Cascade Mountains. We were heading deep into the Okanogan National Forest, toward a closed section of State Route 20, the North Cascades Highway, between Ross Dam Trailhead and Mazama. It was an area completely closed to the public from late November through May due to extreme avalanche hazards. The sheer snowdrifts and sharp drop-offs ensured absolute civilian exclusion, but it also meant that we were flying into a geographical trap. If the storm blocked the pass, there would be no extraction. When the Sea Stallion finally flared and landed, the wheels sinking deep into the fresh drifts, the cabin door dropped. A blast of sub-zero wind hit me, stealing the breath from my lungs. Through the swirling whiteout, I saw the outline of Okanogan Outpost Sector 4. It was a temporary BSL-4 field station constructed from 8 interconnected modular container trailers, chained together and leveled on the frozen earth, surrounded by double chain-link fencing and concertina wire. Armed guards in white winter camouflage stood at the gate, their M16 rifles held across their chests. Captain Elias Vance was waiting in the command module. He was a rigid Cold War military officer in a heavy winter parka. His face looked like it had been carved out of granite, lined and weathered. "Dr. Mercer," Vance said, his voice flat as he checked his watch, "you have 36 hours before this storm completely locks down the pass." The recovery team found it buried under 6 feet of snow in a fresh avalanche chute. They thought it was a grizzly. It isn't. "I want a taxonomic ID, a necropsy report, and a determination of any biological hazards. Get your gear on." Chapter 2, The Hot Zone. The transition from the howling sub-zero blizzard to the interior of the modular lab was a claustrophobic descent into sterilization. The facility was modeled after the expeditionary setups used by USAMRIID's aeromedical isolation team. It was a closed loop of negative pressure container trailers designed to ensure that no airborne pathogen could escape the hot zone. The walls were painted a dull, flat green, and the floors were covered in ribbed gray rubber matting. The air was pressurized, keeping a constant negative flow. It smelled of glutaraldehyde disinfectant, chlorine bleach, and the dry metallic scent of electric heaters. "Dr. Mercer," a voice spoke from behind me. I turned to see Dr. Aris Thorne, a brilliant, tightly wound primatologist brought in from Fort Detrick. She looked exhausted, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Standing beside her was Specialist Miller, a young sweating technician who was frantically adjusting dials on a bank of negative pressure monitors. "We have the specimen in the hot zone," Thorne said, her voice tight. "It's housed inside a Vickers negative pressure transit isolator. Mercer, this isn't like anything in the primate literature. The scale it's impossible. It's too human-like, but too large. Is there a biological hazard, I asked, preparing for the scrub. We don't know, Thorne replied, but we found something else. The recovery team, 2 of the soldiers who helped load the carcass onto the transport truck, are in the medical bay. They aren't sick, but they are in a state of catatonic shock. They keep complaining of a vibration in their chests, a sound they couldn't hear, but could feel. Captain Vance scoffed, checking his rifle. Soldiers get spooked. Miller, keep the generators running. If we lose the power bus, the negative pressure fails. Mercer, get your gear on. I want the preliminary report by midnight. Thorne and I entered the prep room to don our positive pressure Rakel suits. These were bulky yellow vinyl hazmat suits with large transparent bubble hoods. Specialist Miller connected our airlines to the battery-powered respirators worn on our belts. The respirators hummed to life, forcing HEPA-filtered air into our hoods at a rate of 170 liters per minute, puffing the suits out like balloons. Inside the bubble, my breathing sounded loud and mechanical, and my voice echoed through the internal two-way radio. We stepped through the double-pane zip airlock, passing through a glutaraldehyde chemical shower, and entered the dissection module. The room was freezing. The negative pressure pumps hummed a constant low-frequency drone. In the center of the module, resting on a heavy stainless steel operating table, was the Vickers isolator, a flexible, transparent plastic envelope. Inside the plastic, under the glare of the humming fluorescent tubes, lay a massive dark shape. Even through the vinyl, the sheer mass of the creature was staggering. It stretched the entire length of the table, its muscular limbs slightly flexed, frozen in death. Chapter 3, Gross Anatomy. Dr. Mercer, Thorne's voice crackled through my headset. Let's open the isolator. I reached for the sealed access ports of the Vickers isolator, unzipping the negative pressure plastic envelope. The moment the seal parted, a heavy, volatile odor escaped. Even through the HEPA filtration of our recall suits, the smell was overwhelming. It was a combination of sulfur, wet forest decay, and a sharp, metallic primate musk that made my stomach tighten. The odor is highly volatile, I logged, adjusting my bubble hood. Strong organic sulfur compounds suggesting specialized scent glands. It resembles the musk of a wolverine or a bear, but has a distinct chemical profile. We pulled the plastic back, exposing the specimen. It was a male hominid. Beginning external examination at 11:30 a.m., I said. Specimen is a bipedal primate of extraordinary proportions. Estimated height is 8 feet 4 inches. Weight is approximately 900 pounds. The body is covered in a dense, multi-layered pelage of dark brownish-black fur averaging 4 inches in length. Beneath the coarse guard hairs lies a thick, woolly undercoat of gray insulation, a clear adaptation for sub-zero alpine survival. I reached out, running my gloved hand over the creature's head. The skull was elongated, dominated by a massive sagittal crest, a prominent ridge of bone running along the top of the cranium. This ridge, far larger than that of any gorilla, served as the anchor point for a hypertrophied temporalis muscle that must have granted the creature devastating jaw strength. The zygomatic arch was heavily buttressed, wide and thick, designed to absorb the immense mechanical stress of chewing tough winter bark. The face was slate gray, leathery, and relatively hairless. The nose had a flat, broad profile, but unlike an ape, it featured a distinct nasal bridge, directing the nostrils downward. The lips were thin and pulled back in a rigor mortis grin, exposing large, flat, yellowed teeth. Mercer, Dr. Thorne said, pointing her flashlight at the base of the skull. Look at the cervical junction. I leaned in, examining the occipital region, my breath caught in my throat. The foramen magnum is centrally located, I logged, my voice shaking. It is positioned directly beneath the skull, not at the rear as in quadrupedal great apes. This confirms obligate bipedalism. The skeletal structure is designed for a fully bipedal gait. This is not an animal that knuckles walks. We examined the hands and feet. The fingers were thick, but the proportions were human-like, featuring a fully opposable thumb and broad, flat black fingernails caked with dried sap. The palms were covered in thick, leathery calluses nearly 1/4 of an inch deep. The feet were massive, 18.5 inches long and 9 inches wide. The soles were covered in thick, rubbery, slate-gray skin with deep, intricate dermal ridges. No arch, Thorne noted, but there is a distinct mid-tarsal joint, a flexible break in the metatarsal region that allows the foot to bend, accommodating uneven, rocky terrain. This is a highly specialized biped. I'm finding old trauma, I said, pointing to a puckered circular scar on the lateral aspect of the right shoulder. Bullet wound, high-caliber rifle. The bone beneath feels deformed, indicating a healed fracture with a massive deposit of dense scar tissue. This animal survived a close encounter with humans years ago. I shifted my focus to the chest. Cause of death is clear. Severe blunt force trauma to the anterior thoracic cavity. The sternum is depressed and several ribs are fractured. This is consistent with a high-altitude avalanche, crushing the chest and causing massive internal hemorrhaging. Chapter 4. The Stryker Saw. We need to open the chest cavity before the core temperature rises, I said, selecting a heavy surgical scalpel with a fresh blade. I pressed the blade into the skin at the left shoulder to begin the standard Y incision. Immediately the steel dulled. The skin was incredibly tough, nearly half an inch of dense, heavily cornified epidermis and highly fibrous dermis that felt like vulcanized rubber. I had to discard the scalpel and change blades 3 times just to complete the incision down to the pubic symphysis. Exposing the subcutaneous layer, I logged. Adipose tissue is white, highly lobulated, and measures 3 inches in depth along the thoracic wall. This is a massive insulation layer, typical of Arctic mammals. Below the fat lay the muscle. The pectoralis major was a dark purplish-red mass of fibers, incredibly dense and dry. It looked more like the muscle of an elk or a draft horse than a human. "Thorne, get the Stryker saw," I said. She handed me the heavy electric autopsy saw. The Stryker saw whined as I turned it on, the motor screaming in the metallic room. The saw uses an oscillating blade. It vibrates back and forth in minute movements, allowing it to cut through hard bone while passing harmlessly over soft, elastic tissue. I placed the blade against the creature's breastplate. A shower of white dust flew up and the saw groaned. The bone was incredibly hard. The cortical layer was twice the thickness of human bone, dense and calcified. The vibration was so intense that my arms shook inside the Recul suit, the heat of the friction filling the air with the smell of scorched bone and damp hair. The bone density is anomalous. I spoke into my microphone, straining against the resistance. Significant trabecular thickening. The skeleton is built to absorb extreme impact. After 10 minutes of grinding, the sternum was severed. I used a heavy rib spreader to pry the chest open. The ribs popped with a sound like dry branches snapping in a quiet forest. As the thoracic cavity opened, a wave of heat escaped the body, condensing into a thick vapor in the freezing room. We shined our lights down into the chest. The organs were massive. The heart was basketball-sized, resting in a thick, fibrous pericardial sac. The lungs were huge, showing severe pulmonary congestion and dark, non-coagulated blood. But it was the neck anatomy that made Dr. Thorne freeze. "Raymond," she whispered, her voice cracking over the radio. "Look at the lateral thyroid region. Look at those tissue diverticula." I leaned over the chest cavity, shining my flashlight down into the throat. The trachea was massive, 3 inches in diameter, reinforced by thick, overlapping rings of calcified cartilage. But surrounding the larynx was a complex network of hollow, deflated membranous sacs that extended down the neck, under the clavicles, and into the upper chest wall. "This is a system of lateral laryngeal air sacs," I logged, my gloved fingers tracing the delicate tissue. "They are similar to the air sacs found in howler monkeys, Alouatta, but far more structurally developed. They connect directly to the larynx through 2 small apertures below the vocal folds." "Raymond," Thorne said, her voice filled with scientific awe. "Look at the hyoid bone. It's hypertrophied. It's a massive shield-like structure of dense bone." "Yes," I said, realizing what I was looking at. "It acts as a physical acoustic soundboard. In primates, laryngeal air sacs serve as resonance chambers to amplify vocalizations. With a larynx this size and a hyoid this thick, this creature could project sound at frequencies far below the human hearing range." "Infrasound," Thorne said. "Low-frequency sound waves under 20 Hz. They can travel miles through dense timber and solid rock without losing energy. It explains the catatonic state of the soldiers. Their chests were vibrating because they were hit by a high-amplitude, low-frequency wave. But infrasound of that amplitude requires massive thoracic power," I said. "And look at these deltoid attachments. The greater tubercle of the humerus projects laterally, creating an incredible leverage arm. The muscle hypertrophy in the shoulders. This creature could generate immense physical force." "Raymond," Thorne said, her voice dropping. "Infrasound communication is only found in highly social primates. They use it to coordinate hunts, warn of danger, and track each other. If this creature had laryngeal air sacs this developed, he didn't live alone. He belonged to a social pack, and a pack would have heard his distress call before the avalanche hit, I said. Or they tracked his scent when the military truck dragged him here. As I spoke, the surgical instruments on the stainless steel tray began to vibrate. It was a tiny, high-pitched rattle. The scalpels and forceps danced on the metal tray. A second later, a sudden heavy wave of pressure hit my ears, as if the air pressure in the room had dropped instantly. My chest began to hum, a deep, somatic vibration that made my heart hammer in panic. "Miller!" Vance's voice barked over the intercom from the command module. "The pressure monitors are shifting. What's happening?" Chapter 6. The drop in pressure. "I don't know, Captain," Specialist.
"I don't know, Captain."
Specialist Miller's voice crackled back, high-pitched and frantic. "The negative pressure pumps are drawing maximum amperage, but the pressure differential is decaying. And the diesel generator's fuel pressure is fluctuating. The storm is overloading the system." Outside, the wind hit the corrugated metal walls with a physical force that made the modular trailer vibrate on its blocks. But the somatic vibration in the room wasn't the wind. It was a frequency, a deep, heavy pulse that vibrated through the metal, up through the soles of my boots and directly into my skeletal structure. My chest felt squeezed, my lungs struggling to expand against the pressure wave. "Raymond," Dr. Thorne said, her hand flying to her neck. Her vinyl rakel suit hissed as she shook. "Do you feel the pressure?" "My ears, they won't pop." "I feel it," I said, dropping my forceps. The metal instrument hit the tray with a dull clank, but the chattering of the tools didn't stop. "The amplitude is rising. It's an acoustic wave of extreme low frequency." "Thorne, it's hovering around 15 hertz. It's below our hearing threshold, but our bodies are resonating." Suddenly, a wave of hot, greasy nausea hit my stomach. My vision blurred, the harsh fluorescent tubes on the ceiling spinning into long streaks of white. I felt a sudden, inexplicable rush of panic, a biochemical flood of cortisol that made my palms sweat inside my vinyl gloves. It was the primal panic response of a primate sensing an apex predator, triggered entirely by the acoustic wave. "Miller!" I shouted into the intercom, my voice trembling. "Check the primary power grid. We're experiencing a major acoustic event. The air itself is vibrating." "The generator is dropping RPMs, Doctor," Miller yelled back. "The fuel lines are freezing, or something is choking the intake. I'm trying to switch to the backup battery bank, but the solenoids aren't engaging." "Captain Vance," Thorne called out, "get the security team to the perimeter. The creatures, they are using the laryngeal air sacs. They're projecting the wave from the forest." No response. The intercom hummed with a low, rhythmic static that sounded like a heartbeat. The negative pressure pumps began to whine, their pitch dropping as the voltage decayed. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the smell of sulfur and our own cold sweat. And then the frequency shifted. Chapter 7. The Ghost Frequency. The acoustic wave stabilized at exactly 1898 Hz. This was the frequency, the fear frequency. I knew the literature on acoustic resonance. At 19 Hz, the human eyeball begins to resonate, vibrating minutely within its socket. As the wave hit that threshold, my vision went wild. The edges of my bubble hood smeared horizontally. The clean green walls of the module seemed to ripple, and in the corner of my eye, a shadow appeared. It was a dark, towering silhouette standing just outside my central field of vision. I spun my head toward the corner. Nothing. Just the blank green sheet metal and a stack of sterile specimen jars. But the moment I turned back to the table, the shadow returned to my periphery, moving with a silent, menacing agility. "Raymond," Dr. Thorne gasped, her hands flying to her bubble faceplate. There's someone in the room, in the corner. I saw them." "No, Aris," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "It's the ocular resonance. The 1898 Hz frequency is vibrating our eyes. It's creating optical illusions, shadow figures in our peripheral vision. It's a physiological side effect." It feels like we're being watched," she whispered, her eyes wide behind her fogged visor. "The cortisol, I can't think." "It's a biological weapon," I said. "The pack is projecting it to disorient us. It's a pre-attack protocol." On Vance's security channel, the radio suddenly crackled. A guard's voice came through, filled with absolute terror. "Vance, we've got shadows on the western fence." "They aren't." I shined the light, nothing there. "But the thermal is showing 3 massive heat signatures. They're right outside the wire." "Stand your ground, Pearson." Captain Vance's voice cut through, tight and rigid. "It's the storm. The wind is throwing the sensors." "It's not the wind, Captain," Pearson screamed. The concertina wire it's snapping. Something is pulling the..." A blast of static cut Pearson off. The security channel went dead, replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of the infrasound wave. Thump, 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 thump. The air pressure in the module suddenly surged. The pressurized plastic curtains separating the decontamination room rippled violently, and the fluorescent lights above us flickered twice, then died. Chapter 8, The Generator Fails. We were plunged into an absolute freezing darkness. The constant hum of the BSL-4 negative pressure pumps died instantly. The silence was overloading my senses, broken only by the howling wind outside and the sound of our own heavy breathing inside the recall suits. "Miller," Vance's voice barked through the static-filled headset. "Report." "Generator's dead, Captain." Miller's voice was panicked. "The primary diesel engine just locked up. Something stuffed the air intake." I shined my flashlight out the utility port. The intake pipe is packed solid with frozen mud and gravel. It was rammed down the duct with enough force to shatter the steel casing. "Switch to the backup batteries," Vance ordered. "The battery cables are gone, sir," Miller cried. "The main utility line, it was ripped out of the junction box on the trailer wall. The copper wires are shredded. We're on emergency battery panels, but they only power the command module's lights and our radios. The lab has no power. The HVAC is dead." As the pumps stopped, the negative pressure vanished. The temperature in the cold module began to plummet rapidly, falling toward the sub-zero reality of the Okanogan blizzard. Within minutes, my breath began to freeze on the inside of my bubble hood, forming a layer of white frost that blocked my vision. "Raymond," Dr. Thorne's voice crackled, her breath shallow. "My respirator, it's stopping. The battery is freezing." My respirator was dying too. The motor whined, sputtering as the cold drained the lithium cells. Without the positive pressure airflow, carbon dioxide was beginning to build up inside our hoods. My chest burned, and my head throbbed with a dull hypoxic ache. "We have to breach the suits," I said, my teeth chattering in the cold. "But the contamination," Thorne objected. "There is no pathogen, Aris," I said, reaching for the heavy brass zipper at my neck. "If we keep these suits on, we suffocate or freeze. The battery can't heat the air." I pulled the zipper down. The cold hit my skin like a physical blow. The air in the room was freezing, smelling of the metallic musk of the specimen and the sharp chemical scent of glutaraldehyde. We pulled our hoods back, our plumes of breath immediately condensing into white clouds in the red emergency light. "Miller," Vance's radio crackled. "Get the security team to the utility corridor. We have movement on the roof." We stood in the cold room, our flashlights cutting beams of white through the red-lit haze. Above us, we heard a sound. A heavy, dragging sound directly on the sheet metal roof of our container.
Scrape, scrape, scrape.
Then came a thud that shook the entire trailer on its blocks. The metal ceiling bowed downward, the steel seams groaning under a weight that must have been hundreds of pounds. Chapter 9, Tactile Assault. "They're testing the structural seams," Dr. Thorne whispered, her flashlight beam fixed on the ceiling panel. Small flakes of insulation and frozen condensation drifted down like snow. "They aren't just testing," I said, shining my light at the corner joints. "Look at the frame." The steel wall was groaning, the vertical metal studs bowing inward. The creatures weren't trying to smash through the reinforced steel doors. They were exploiting the inherent engineering vulnerability of modular construction. Okanogan Outpost Sector 4 was held to the frozen ground by auger ground anchors. These anchors are designed to resist vertical uplift and lateral wind loads. But wind tunnel tests show they can displace under lateral forces of 4,000 to 4,700 pounds. A family group of primates possessing the muscular leverage and deltoid attachments of a gorilla can exert localized pulling forces that mimic a catastrophic wind load.
Pop, pop.
Two heavy steel rivets sheared off the corner seam, flying across the room and bouncing off the stainless steel table. The trailer shifted, tilting 3 degrees to the left. The surgical tools slid down the tray, clattering into the drain of the table. "Raymond!" Thorne cried, grabbing the edge of the operating table to steady herself.
"The container, it's shifting."
"The ground anchors are failing," I said. "They're pulling the modular frames from the outside. They're trying to separate the trailers." "Vance," I yelled into my radio, "the lab module is losing its anchor alignment. The frame is warping." "We've got our own problems, Mercer." Vance's voice came back, accompanied by the sound of wind howling. The command module's door is buckled. Something is wrapping steel cables around the exterior handles. They're locking us in. Miller, I called out. Can you clear the generator? No, sir. Miller's voice was frantic. The utility vestibule, the frame is shifting so fast the doors are jammed. I'm trapped in the electrical compartment. The cables, they're pulling the main wiring harness through the wall. Through the tear in the ceiling, a massive, hair-covered hand reached down. The fingers were long, the knuckles thick and covered in coarse black fur. The palm was black and leathery, the fingernails worn and caked with yellow pine sap. The hand swept across the ceiling cavity, searching for something. It gripped the main wiring harness, a bundle of thick, insulated copper cables that fed the BSL-4 laboratory's emergency batteries. With a single, effortless twist of its wrist, the creature ripped the harness out. The red emergency lights flickered and died. Chapter 10, The Revelation. Now we were in total, absolute darkness. The only light came from the narrow beams of our flashlights, cutting through the thick vapor of our breath and the falling snow that was beginning to accumulate on the floor. The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly, falling toward the sub-zero reality of the Washington winter outside. Stand your ground, Vance yelled, his flashlight beam shaking as he aimed it at the hole in the ceiling. Miller, secure the door. Davis, get the lanterns. No one moved. The air in the room was suddenly so thick, so heavy with infrasound, that it felt like we were underwater. My chest vibrated, the bones in my sternum humming with a dull, aching pain. From the roof above we heard a whistle. It was a long descending note, filled with an unsettling, mournful quality. They had isolated the cold module. They knew their dead was inside. Raymond, Dr. Thorne said, her voice shaking as she shone her flashlight on the dissected carcass. They're executing a reclamation protocol. Primates in the wild, they have a deep understanding of death. Chimpanzees and gorillas have been observed carrying dead infants for weeks, defending the bodies against zookeepers. They aren't hunting us, they're mourning. They view us as scavengers, I said, the realization hitting me with cold clarity. We dragged their kin into a steel box and cut him open. To them, we are mutilating their dead. And they won't stop until they get him back, Thorne said. Raymond, the infrasound, they're using it to paralyze our nervous systems. They're neutralizing our defenses without even touching us. It's a coordinated siege. Captain Vance, I yelled into the radio, let us slide the specimen outside. If we give them the carcass, the siege stops. They don't want us, they want their dead. I will not surrender government property to wild animals, Mercer. Vance roared back. Miller, get the security team to the airlock. If they breach the inner door, open fire. Your weapons won't work in this cold, Vance, I warned. The oil in the firing pins will freeze. You're bringing knives to a battle with a force of nature. Crack! A sound like a lightning strike echoed through the utility corridor. The steel seams of the cold room warped further, the floor buckling upward. The auger ground anchors on the western side of our trailer had snapped. The module tilted another 5 degrees, the stainless steel table groaning as it began to slide toward the airlock door. Chapter 11, The Breach. In the beam of my flashlight, the airlock's thick double-pane glass window showed a spiderweb of cracks. Through the frosted glass, illuminated by our sweeping beams, we saw the silhouette. It was a creature standing on the metal steps of the outer airlock. It was slightly smaller than the one on the table, perhaps 7.5 feet tall, but its shoulders were immensely wide. Its coat of fur was white with frost, and its yellow eyes were fixed on us, or rather past us on the dissected carcass. Crash! The outer window pane shattered, sending fragments of reinforced glass clattering onto the metal steps. The creature didn't smash the glass again. It reached its long, muscular arm around the door frame, its thick fingers finding the manual decompression latch. It understood the mechanism. It had watched the soldiers operate the pressure relief valve. With a grinding screech of freezing metal, the creature turned the brass lever, releasing the pressure seal. A blast of sub-zero wind exploded through the gaskets, carrying a thick cloud of white snow that blinded us instantly. The negative pressure barrier was gone. The laboratory had completely failed containment. Miller, Captain Vance's voice screamed from the corridor. They're in the anteroom. Pearson is down. The inner airlock door, buckled by the shifting frame of the trailer, swung open with a screech. The wind howled through the opening, carrying the sub-zero reality of the Okanogan forest directly into the cold module. The chemical showers in the decontamination zone froze solid in seconds. The the glutaraldehyde solution turning into green ice that cracked the plastic nozzles. Through the airlock stepped the giant male, the 9-foot alpha we had seen on the roof of the power module. His fur was matted with ice, and his chest showed a long, superficial tear from a bullet wound. But he ignored the cold, his nostrils flared, taking in the scent of formaldehyde bleach and the blood of his kin. Behind him came 2 others, the smaller gray one from the window, and a third long-limbed creature with a lighter reddish coat. They filled the modular trailer, their heads touching the groaning ceiling. "Fire!" Vance screamed, running into the room with his M16 raised. "Fire!" Chapter 12, The Standoff. Vance pulled the trigger. Click, click. The weapon failed. The extreme cold, combined with the moisture from the blizzard blowing through the airlock, had frozen the oil in the firing pins. The security guards behind him met the same fate, a series of dry, useless clicks that sounded like toys against the roar of the wind. "Miller, draw your sidearms," Vance ordered, reaching for his Colt 45. Before his fingers could touch the grip, the giant male opened his mouth. He didn't roar. He released a concentrated wave of infrasound. It was a physical wall of pressure that hit us like a blast wind. The frequency was so low, so intense, that my chest cavity hummed in agony. The blood pressure in my ears spiked and my vision went black at the edges. My eyeballs vibrated so violently that the room smeared into a red-lit haze of spinning lines. Vance dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his head as he collapsed to his knees, his nose bleeding. The security guards fell beside him, one of them vomiting onto the snowy floor, completely incapacitated by the vertigo and nausea. Thorne and I fell against the metal wall, our knees buckling, our hands cupped over our ears. The creatures ignored the guards. They ignored the weapons. They walked past the groveling soldiers as if they were nothing but rocks in a stream. The alpha creature stepped up to the stainless steel operating table. He looked down at the carcass. Chapter 13, The Shriek. The dissected body lay under the beams of our dropped flashlights. The chest Y incision was open, the ribs spread wide, exposing the internal organs to the freezing air. The tissue samples we had taken sat in clear glass jars of 10% neutral buffered formalin on the side counter. The alpha creature reached out. His massive 5-fingered hand brushed the cheek of the dead specimen. The movement was incredibly gentle. He cleared the frost from the dead male's brow ridge, his fingers running through the matted fur of the face. Then he saw the chest Y incision. He saw the specimen jars containing the tissues. The alpha turned his head toward the ceiling, his jaw opening wide. He released a shriek. It was not a low-frequency rumble. It was a high-pitched, deafening shriek of pure, unadulterated grief and rage. It cut through the howling wind, vibrating the sheet metal walls until they rang like bells. The sound was so filled with a tragic, human-like sorrow that it made my skin crawl. I looked at Dr. Thorne. She was crying, her face wet with tears that froze on her cheeks. In that moment, the clinical detachment that had protected my sanity for 30 years shattered completely. I wasn't a pathologist dissecting a specimen. I was a butcher who had mutilated a sentient being's brother, father, or son. We had brought our sterile biomedical science into their forest, and we had desecrated their dead. The other 2 creatures answered the shriek with low, mournful clicks and whistles. They gathered around the table, their hands locking with the cold, stiff fingers of the carcass. They leaned their heads against the body, a collective ritual of mourning that was older than the mountains. The alpha creature looked down at us. His yellow eyes met mine through the red gloom. There was no animal madness in them. There was only a cold, ancient judgment. Chapter 14, Dismantling the Lab. The alpha creature turned back to the table. He did not touch us. We were beneath his concern. He slid his massive arms beneath the 900-pound carcass, lifting it off the steel table in a single fluid movement. The internal organs shifted, the steel rib spreader falling to the floor with a loud clang. But the other 2 creatures were not finished. They targeted the lab equipment. The smaller gray male swept his arm across the side counter, smashing the specimen jars. The glass shattered, spilling the formalin and the tissue samples into the snow that covered the floor. They systematically destroyed the Stryker Saw, the surgical trays, the microscope, and the audio recorder, crushing the metal under their heels. They were erasing our work. They were reclaiming every piece of their kin that we had cut away. The combined weight of the 3 hominids, the carcass, and the shifting steel table was too much for the trailer's floor. The OS4 modules were constructed of lightweight steel and plywood sheets over a steel frame. Crack, snap. The floor joists beneath the dissection table buckled. The ribbed gray rubber matting tore open as the floor sank 3 feet. The trailer's frame twisted, the sheet metal walls peeling back from the ceiling seams. "Raymond!" Thorne screamed, her flashlight beam showing the ground beneath the trailer. The frozen soil of the ravine was visible through the collapsed floor. "The container is breaking apart," I yelled. "Get to the airlock." The trailer shifted violently. The remaining auger ground anchors on the eastern side snapped with a sound like pistol shots. Without its anchors, the module was nothing but a steel box resting on a 30-degree snowy slope. The trailer began to slide. Chapter 15: The Escape and Aftermath. The container accelerated down the ravine, sliding over the hard-packed snow. Inside, we were thrown against the walls. The stainless steel table broke loose from its mounts, crashing through the utility door. The airlock frame collapsed, throwing a blast of freezing snow and wind directly into our faces. "Aris, jump!" I screamed, grabbing Dr. Thorne by the arm. We scrambled through the open, tearing seam of the wall, throwing ourselves out of the sliding container and into the deep snowdrift of the ravine. I hit the snow, rolling down the slope until I was stopped by a thick hemlock trunk. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and the cold instantly penetrated my clothing. Through the swirling whiteout, I saw the modular lab trailer slide another 50 feet before crashing into a massive rock outcrop, the metal frame folding like an accordion. I looked up the slope. Silhouetted against the white storm, the 3 creatures were moving. The alpha carried the carcass, his long strides clearing the drifts with ease. The others flanked him, their dark shapes fading into the pines as they headed toward the high passes of the Kettle River Range. They were gone. They had reclaimed their dead. Dr. Thorne and I survived because Specialist Miller, who had managed to escape the command trailer before it buckled, found us in the drift. He dragged us back to the remains of the generator shed, where we huddled around a small propane heater until dawn. Captain Vance was never found. The slide had buried the command module under 10 feet of ice and rock. By 8 a.m., the blizzard cleared. 3 heavy-track military snowcats arrived from the valley, carrying a cleanup crew from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They didn't ask if we were injured. They didn't offer blankets. They immediately cordoned off the ravine. Within 6 hours, every piece of the collapsed trailer was loaded onto flatbeds. The broken glass, the formalin, the blood-soaked snow, everything was shoveled into containment drums. The site was scrubbed until it looked like nothing but a natural avalanche chute. I was kept in a military isolation cell at Fort Lewis for 5 days. On the 6th day, a man in a gray suit sat across from me in a windowless room. "Dr. Mercer," he said, sliding a document toward me, "you will sign this. You will state that Okanogan Outpost Sector 4 suffered a structural collapse due to a weather-induced landslide, resulting in the deaths of Captain Vance and his security team. You will never mention the specimen. You will never mention Dr. Thorne." We cut into a bipedal hominid, direct evidence of a sister branch of the Homo lineage, I said, my voice hoarse. "They have a language. They mourn their dead. You can't redact that." "We can, Doctor," the man said, his voice flat. "And we will. Sign or you will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary in Kansas under a classification that doesn't exist." I signed the paper. I spent 35 years keeping that silence. But I am old now, and the agency men who threaten me are dead. I don't care about their NDAs anymore. Dr. Aris Thorne died in Maryland 10 years ago. She never went back to the Cascades, but she kept a jar of hemlock needles on her desk until her last day. I know the truth. We are not the masters of the continent. We are merely tenants living in the low valleys, while something older, stronger, and far more unified rules the high freezing timber. If you ever find yourself on Route 20 in the winter, and your eyeballs begin to vibrate, and the shadows in the corner of your eye begin to move, turn back. They are already there, and they do not forgive those who desecrate their dead.